between that period of time. Every month we're uploading data so that we can see how we're trending in comparison to the forecast, but it's officially submitted twice a year. And it's really just a series of assumptions. So those are all outlined in the attached notes that you can find to the forecast. Those will be on our website and they're submitted to ODE as well. But I'll walk through some of those underlying assumptions that we've made for this forecast. And the assumptions are all based on historical trends largely, but then also we adjust and include adjustments for known circumstances. So, for example, inflation. So we know that that's going to be out of the norm based on our historical trends, so we've adjusted for that. We have, of course, collective bargaining terms that we know for the next 3 years, and then some of the cooperative strategies data that we've looked at the past couple of meetings has been included as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is a forecast, it's not a budget, it's not a spending plan. It is really designed to be a transparent look into the district's long-term financial status. So we do a monthly financial report. This is the longer-term version of that. Any questions on that before we jump in?
And is the 5-year forecast always put on our website?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have actually I just have a link to the ODE site where you can pull it up from there, so that way you're always pulling up the latest version. And you can also see the whole long history there, so it allows you to select which version of the forecast you want to see.
So you could go into
Yes.
class and see.
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, so jumping into the forecast summary graph that we always look at. So just as a reminder, the black bars on this graph represent total revenue in each of those years. The gray bar is total expenditures, and then the orange at the top, that is the income tax renewal. The green line then represents the cash balance with the income tax renewal included, and then the red line represents the cash balance without the income tax renewal. So the green line is pretty flat there through the next 5 years, and that's showing that really we kind of fluctuate a little bit back and forth with revenue coming in slightly higher than expenditures, then we dip back down. But we're pretty level as far as cash balance goes over the life of the forecast. In contrast, the red line is pretty steeply declining. And really what's to note here is the difference between those two lines. So that would be the deficit without the income tax renewal out in 27. So as you can see, without the income tax renewal, the cash balance diminishes quickly. That is all relying on the assumptions that we have that we'll walk through so that everybody's comfortable with what's going into here. But that is the general high-level takeaway from the 5-year forecast.
Are you talking about the income tax? Is this forecast, was this made before or after this particular levy did not get passed?
So it was adjusted based on that, because once the income tax is passed or made permanent, or even just passed for a number of years, you move it up into the forecast line item and it becomes part of your revenue. You don't have to show it separately. So until it is renewed, we have to show it as not being passed as a permanent levy or as a levy beyond that initial 5 years. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if it had passed, we would have adjusted and we wouldn't even be looking at that. It would all be included in total revenue.
Right.
It would, the black bar would just be all inclusive. So we kind of had those two versions that we were looking at and making adjustments to. But largely, and I'll get into this, largely the changes that have been made since May really include the enrollment growth related to and expected from Intel and other developments.
Okay.
But we'll get into that. Thank you.
And yeah, and so to be clear, like, we make no assumption about future levies, but we use this strategic forecast as a planning tool
Right.
to do scenario planning. So this is just two of the many scenarios, right? One with the income tax and one without it.
Right.
Right? And it's just kind of a functional tool like that. We haven't made any assumptions yet, we haven't put it on and so forth, but it's really helpful to see the magnitude of that. We also operate on a fiscal year basis. is 2023 this current school year?
Yes, so 2023 is this current year. So the way the fiscal year works is you use the last year of the date range. So we operate on a July 1st through June 30th basis. So the current fiscal year runs from July 1st, 2022 through June 30th, 2023, which is fiscal year 23. So yes, this first one here's the current year. So we're almost halfway through that year. So obviously that year is the most accurate in terms of the forecast, and then as you get out and get further into your assumptions and basing off of trend, it gets less accurate as you move out.
Is it possible to refer to it as 2022/2023 in the first part?
Yeah.
I've heard people kind of confused about what, fiscal year means and calendar year, and like, they don't realize it, like, this is 2023 now from the school district's financial perspective. That might be a nice note to make.
Yeah, it gets very confusing when you layer in property taxes, especially because property taxes are collected in arrears. So like if you think about tax year 2021, that's collected in calendar year 2022, which is split for us between fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023. So when you start getting into all of those, it's very overwhelming and confusing.
Yeah.
But it is clear that deficit spending would begin in this next coming school
In next year, yep,
Okay.
in 24. And
Yeah,
we'll
so
actually
that's-
see that on this next
Okay.
slide pretty clearly,
Okay.
yep. Okay, so jumping into the changes since May. So this one on the top, that is the forecast as it stood in May. Then at the bottom, that's the current version. So obviously the major difference is that we have 22 actuals now, and we've added the assumptions for 27. But to provide some context for the numbers, so that we're comparing apples to apples, if you look at this line item here, that is the ending cash balance with the levy included. So in May, we were looking at, in fiscal year 26, ending at 18.9 million. Now that's dropped down to 14.6. And then if you look at the bottom line, the ending cash balance without the levies, in 26, the May forecast said we would be at about 5 million. Now we're looking at a negative cash balance of negative 945,000. So what's the big difference there? That's the enrollment factor. So we'll get into that, but just one other item to note here on this slide, this negative 2.9 million. So again, remember, this is the November forecast down here. And what that line means, that's the revenue surplus or deficit in that specific fiscal year without the income tax renewal. So that means if the income tax is not renewed in fiscal year 2024, which is next year, we're projecting $2.9 million deficit. So that means that we're spending $2.9 million more than what we're expected to bring in. So that's kind of what would need to be reconciled if the income tax is not renewed. I also highlighted too, in 27, since we do have that year on here, the ending cash balance in 27 without the income tax renewal would be negative $11 million. So that is important to highlight as well. Okay, so what are underlying assumptions? So I talked about the cooperative strategies data and including the Intel factor, if you will. So on the left, just as a reminder, this is our historical number of new single-family home builds per year. We average about 20 in the recent past, the exception being in the early 2000s with Park Trails being around closer to 100 per year, but we're typically at about 20. So a typical forecast, pre-Intel announcement, we were projecting about 20 new builds per year. Given the scenarios that Cooperative Strategies has provided, we've looked at, well, what does enrollment look like if we're adding 60 units per year? And this is the graph that takes that into account, looking at land availability, what's highly developable, what's already owned by developers, And this is kind of the projection that they put together. Obviously, this is a very long range. You probably can't see this, but the very end, the year is 2148 or 49. So obviously very long term. So we're really just looking here in the first few years. But we do have some actual solid current data to point to. And that is current developments that are already underway. So these are the breakdown of homes coming that are either already in progress or will be shortly. And so 60 new homes based on this information is very reasonable based on what we're currently seeing. So obviously if a new development that's not listed here comes on and breaks ground, we'll adjust and make any changes to that kind of May, but this is the information that we have now. So we're going with the 60 homes per year.
And this is all new information since the May forecast, right? Because the
Right.
Cooperative Strategies Group we engaged did this thorough analysis of real estate and looked at a lot of different scenarios and possibilities. So this 60 units per year, right, is kind of what we've settled in on as opposed to 20 units per year in the past, right? Which seems like a big increase, but seems sort of reasonable given what's probably heading our way.
Yep.
At least for, in my opinion, at least for the next few years, I don't put a lot of stock into what happens out by 2149, right? Because I don't know exactly how to forecast that far out. I mean, forecasting more than a couple of years is always tricky.
Yeah.
But I think those are solid numbers for the near term, which is really going to drive the rest of the finances in the forecast.
Yep.
And I'd also point out that one of the main drivers of the land use conversation is water and sewer availability. And we just read in the article today that water and sewer is being extended, or water at least is being extended more towards the boundary of Granville schools. So things are changing every single day. So, we're trying to forecast, but just understand that things change relatively rapidly. And we weren't aware of anything related to Southwest Licking Water related to that process until that article came out. Today. And we've been at just about every planning meeting possible over the last 4 months.
Is this the union?
No, this is a separate issue that was in the Advocate today, and we appreciate it being there because we wouldn't have known about it. So, and water, sewer, utilities drive development, period. So that's something that we will have to keep our eyes on, and we'll factor into, again, we're looking at the changes since May, and in May, we're going to be looking at the changes since November. And so, again, we refine those projections over time to say, okay, what's happened in the in-between, and how do we make adjustments? So just wanted to point that piece out because, we're talking about these developments that are imminent, but there are probably others that will also circulate and pop up relatively soon.
I have not seen the Advocate article yet. Where?
So, and I'm not going to get this completely accurate.
Right, so I don't
Yeah, I know, you didn't write it. So there was, the commissioners approved the extension of Southwest Licking Water into Jersey, Alexandria, and Johnstown, Monroe, without their knowledge. I guess.
St. Albans Township.
In St. Albans Township and several other locations.
Is
So,
that in our district?
no,
It's
not right now.
Order of our district,
It's-
right? And so the Southwest Licking Water and Sewer Service has been very aggressive in expanding their service range, which has really driven a lot of the development in the school districts to the west of here. And it's been drastic for some districts to see their enrollment double or more, right, with the availability of water and sewer for dense housing, right? And so that's a huge factor that we need to keep our eye on that can drive things like annexation. We have strong partnerships with our townships, but townships don't necessarily have, as we are seeing in St. Albans Township to the west of here, control, right? They can get annexed in a heartbeat and they don't have the control of that housing density and so forth. And so those school districts are facing very different kinds of challenges.
And just like infrastructure is important for municipalities, infrastructure is important for schools. So as development, I'm not saying that, we understand that we're going to grow. What we're trying to do is make sure that we're ahead of the growth that occurs, so that we don't have situations where students are, in situations that aren't ideal for learning from a building perspective. And so all these things factor into that conversation and into those assumptions. So that was just my small point that became large.
Thank you. Appreciate it. No, you're fine. Okay, so how does that translate into something tangible for the forecast? It's really driving enrollment projections. So on the graph on the left, this shows the yield model for the age of the home compared to the number of students yielded from that home at each stage in that home's life. So basically what this shows is that a brand new home tends to yield about 1.2 students in this district. So 60 new homes essentially equates to 72 new students right out the gate. So we have taken our enrollment for the current year, so again, fiscal year 2023, we're at 2613 and added 72 students in each of the next 4 years. And again, prior to that, you can see, because I kept some of the history on here, we had some small growth from year to year, but really it was pretty flat. So this would be a significant change in the enrollment trend.
And this is really not a facilities plan or a capital plan and so forth. This is an operating budget plan, but this certainly plays into that. And my conclusion after seeing this is like, we really didn't know sort of what to assume with enrollment growth and so forth. But here we see, okay, it's a 287 student growth over the period, the forecast period. We've also looked at facilities planning, and we know that's stretching our capacity from a facilities perspective.
Especially at K-6.
Especially at the K-6 level, which is something that the strategic task force that's been formed will be kind of using as their guidance to be able to provide some ideas to the district about where to go with that. I was encouraged though that it wasn't much more than that, to tell you the truth. I mean, that's historically high, but it's not much more than Park Trails. Park Trails had that same number of students in a shorter period of time. All right. 440 years, 500 a year, right?
Well, we weren't at
Yes.
So, but anyway, I was
Yeah.
just trying to get calibrated on the numbers and think about like, oh my gosh, how much change is this going to be, right? And it's big given the historically relatively slow growth of Granville. It's not through the roof, right? Based on what some districts around here are going to see or what the potential is ultimately, but it starts us down this path of growth that we're expecting.
And Thomas, I think,
And maybe I'm making too many assumptions there, correct me if I'm wrong.
We weren't anywhere close to capacity at that time, so it's kind of irrelevant, because we're not gonna have the same experience with this amount of growth at this point, being at almost at capacity.
Yeah. Well, so I think the important piece to kind of remember related to Park Trails is that was a small window of time that really accelerated growth.
Yeah.
That's 100 new homes for five years.
Mhm.
That creates a very different trajectory on that path.
Right.
And one area that comes in that is a little bit higher density will change that trajectory
Right.
significantly, which could put you behind in enrollment growth and facilities. And that's why I think it's really important to understand that from a strategic planning perspective, thinking about land acquisition, thinking about, future bonds for a new building are going to be on a very short horizon for us in the near future. With
We'll have to be
our
responsive,
elementary, yeah.
Right, to kind of development opportunities that they pop up and things like that and so forth. And that's why and the strategic task force is really helping us out, kind of craft like, what's not going to happen in the next 5 years, but where do we need to be 20, 30 years from now, and how do we back that up to the actions that we need to take today?
Yep.
Right, because it's really shifted our mentality. I've always been in this mode of like, we're going to continue to grow slowly. Sometime we'll need a new school. We kind of know we need one more school. Now we're like, we need to think 30 years down the road, and how many schools do we need at build-out, sort of, if you will, and back that up to what our actions are today.
When 49% of our land is in ag right now. So
Yeah.
that should give you an indication of the potential. And
So I didn't mean to distract us from kind of the operating budget here aside by talking about the capital and facilities, but that's another moving piece that's an important part of it for the community.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm curious whether the yield model, what happens after 35 years, because homes don't disintegrate?
No, it tends to just flatline
Okay.
from there.
And
Is
that,
that correct, Jeff?
yeah, that's a national model that's been utilized, that tends to hold true. And when the red line is the national trend. And so our model actually, if you lay over it, the line of best fit actually does pretty well for that national model.
Okay, so jumping into the revenue overview. So on the left, we have a graph that shows our revenue sources over time as a percentage of the total in 2022, fiscal year 2022 compared to 2027. And the reason it's important to show it over that 5-year period of time is to see if there's anything changing there. And really, the item that's changing is the gray portion here, which is the income tax. So it's currently at about 20% of our total operating revenue, and that's expected to increase about 22% by the end of this forecast, and that does include it being renewed.
And this is
Obviously-
obviously a scenario of the renewal of the existing rate.
What's that?
Scenario of the renewal of the existing rate.
Yes. So obviously, if it were to not be renewed in '27, it would drop down to almost zero. We would just be collecting basically late payments at that point. So that is significant, and I have an individual slide on the income tax, but because the income tax is the only portion of this total pie that grows at all over time or has the ability to grow over time, that is why it is growing as a percentage of the total revenue source. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a couple questions. So I know we don't get much federal money. And I know it's probably like apples to oranges, but like a Newark, let's say, or I don't know, another district nearby, what is their percentage of federal money?
So federal money does not come into this equation here because this is just general fund. So federal money all goes into separate designated funds because federal money is always tied to a specific purpose.
Okay.
So like the COVID money, that was
Yes.
federal, it's not included here because
Okay.
it is restricted in purpose. So it goes into its own restricted fund. So the other thing too with federal dollars is it's usually supplement, not supplant rules, meaning that it has to be additional services beyond what you're previously providing. So it's not taking away or adding to really anything that we're looking at here since this is just general fund. Is that?
Yeah, and then my other question, I know that people had questions or have brought up the idea of grants. And I just, if you could speak a little bit up, where do grants get put in this? Do they get put in here? And what percentage are we actually thinking about when it comes to grants? So the understanding that to write the grant is also a huge time, takes a lot of time.
Yeah. So our large grants are all the federal grants, the Title I, Title II, Title IV, IDAB. That's all handled through a consolidated grant application process at ODE. Those are the ones that are in restricted funds, so they don't tie in here.
Okay.
And really, any grant is restricted in purpose because you're applying for a particular purpose. So no grants, whether they're local, state, or federal, come into the forecast here.
Okay.
So we had like a safety grant we approved, that's not included here. And that's actually a federal grant as well, so that's gonna be in a restricted fund by itself. We had the Martha Holden Jennings grant, that's again in a separate fund, that's not federal, but again, it's not here. And those also are all new projects, not taking away from expenses that would otherwise be hitting here. It's more like if we don't get the grant, we don't buy the thing. Does that
And
make
generally,
sense?
grants are not something you can use or find in order to have more people in the building.
Correct, yes. The thing, so in particular, like the COVID funding, we have an intervention position at the elementary and have been very clear that that position may or may not be able to continue depending on having revenue available to support that position at the end of the grant period.
Right.
So there are some, like IDAB, we know we're always going to have that as a funding source. It varies in the amount from year to year, so we do use that to fund about 6 teachers, I think, each year. But that's an ongoing annual grant, that's not one-time money, so
Right.
that's reliable in terms of paying salaries. But yeah, one-time funding, like the COVID dollars is, it gets very hard if you try to fund staff out of that, for the reason that it would need to come back into the operating fund or somewhere else if you wanted to continue with that position.
Cecile, another aspect of competitive grants, typically there is some type of poverty or wealth factor in the grant application process. So there are a lot of grants that we don't even qualify for based on our wealth. And so, you know, I know that there's quite a few grants right now out there that ODE is posting, that some of those we aren't even eligible for to apply for. So
I was just talking to somebody about this today at the conference. To clarify, Jeff doesn't mean our wealth as as a school, like how much money we have in our account, he means taxpayer wealth.
Right.
Yes.
So it's based on like how many students we have, for example, like on free and reduced lunches
Right.
and stuff like that. So we don't get much funding from the state because we're considered a wealthy district. And we also don't qualify for grants because we're considered a wealthy district. So we're
And-
very dependent on taxpayer money, but it's very difficult because, as you all know, we did not manage past the renewal.
And also, we're on a list for the Facilities Commission, but we probably would never, ever see $1 of matching funds for any facility construction process through the OFCC. So that's another thing that is also wealth dependent. So.
And when the state
in many-
looks to make cuts too, as they did in 2020, when they cut our state funding, that was again based on wealth. So we got hit by getting our state funding reduced, and then we didn't get as much COVID dollars as other districts because that was distributed based on wealth.
So, and I think going into a higher growth environment, people might hear residents from another community that said, oh, well, the state matched our construction process by 50%, so our local effort was 50%. Our local effort's going to be 100%. Our residents will bear the entire cost of any future facilities.
On that note, can I plug in about reaching out to local politicians about that?
Feel free.
Okay, so the Ohio School Boards Association, I was there at a conference earlier today, is working on legislation that would guarantee more state funding for schools so that the burden is less on taxpayers. I am a huge proponent of that. If you also believe that our schools should get more state funding so that the burden doesn't rely so heavily on our district, then I would encourage you to reach out to your local politicians, because if I do it alone, it's not going to make a big difference. If we all do it, it might. So please take the time to do that.
But not us, not these local politicians.
No, Senator Brown and Senator Vance.
Yes.
Oh, goodness.
And a couple of things that
Oh, that's right, no, it
Yeah,
wouldn't be for,
state.
it would be state.
a couple other quick things on this, George. First of all, we're talking a lot about state funding, right? What assumptions have been made for state funding, and what do you believe is the stability of that state funding over time? Do you have another slide?
We
on
have
that?
3 more slides,
Okay,
so
great.
let's keep going. We'll be here all night.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, looking at property tax revenue and the specific assumptions going into that. So again, we talked a lot at last month's meeting about this, but I wanted to emphasize it again, that we have minimal growth in this line item because as property values go up due to reappraisal, which they are expected to do by as much as 30% in 2023, the tax rate is adjusted down so that the district does not collect additional revenue. So that's House Bill 920, and that's specific to schools. So we are the only taxing entity that does not see additional revenue due to the reappraisal process. So with that in mind, I did include the 30% number in here for tax year 2023, but you don't see any significant increase in our revenue in the out years, and that's why, that reduction factor. The only growth that we do see is due to new construction and inside millage, which is a very small portion of our total operating millage. As far as new construction assumptions, so we talked about the 60 new builds for residential development and where that number is coming from. As far as the commercial side, we have our history to go on, which has kind of been all over the place because the total amount of commercial value that we have in the district is so small. Any change there really skews the history. So 500,000 is about in alignment with historical trends. And the big difference between residential assumptions and commercial assumptions in this forecast has to do with the fact that nothing's currently happening. So we see the residential developments going in, and we can point to those, and we can use those numbers that we saw on the previous slide to come up with educated guesses of what we're going to see. We don't have that for commercial development, and it's kind of unlikely that we will really over the next few years, because commercial development requires water and sewer, which I've learned more about in the last 4 months than I ever thought I would want to know. So I do know that, and that's what's going to drive commercial development. So we know Intel's coming, we know the suppliers are going to have to move somewhere, but they need sewer and water to be able to come. So until we have more information on what that's going to look like, especially in terms of a JED, for example. So a JED doesn't generate in and of itself additional revenue for the school district. It's typically a way for a township or for a village or city to extend its income tax into a township that would not otherwise be subject to that income tax. For the purpose of developing water, sewer lines, that kind of thing, but the JED in and of itself is not going to generate revenue for the school district, most likely. Other economic development tools, TIF CRAs, those are tax abatements. So the school, again, does not receive additional revenue if those abatements go through. Long term, yes, after 15, 30 years when the abatement falls off, the district will see more revenue, but as far as the 5-year forecast period is concerned, those type of economic development tools are not going to generate additional revenue in this line item.
I have a question on this.
Anything to say on that, actually?
If you would like to make a public comment, maybe you could do that in the public comment session, and then we'll try and answer it then, if that's okay. But make a note of it, and we'd love to hear about it. Yeah.
And assuming we did get that 30% increase in property taxes,
Property value.
property value, would that even be enough to cover the cost of our growth?
No, because we don't receive additional revenue from it.
Yeah, but if we did,
Oh,
If
The amount-
920 didn't exist.
would that even be
Yeah.
enough? Or-
yeah, that would be significant.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because it would basically then equate to a 30% increase in our revenue on 50% of our total revenue would go up 30%. So
Yeah.
these bars would be up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And House Bill 920 is the House bill that happened in the 70s that created levy cycles.
Yeah.
That is, the only reason why you have to come back every 3 to 5 years or beyond is because we don't get growth. And that created the levy cycles that we have now today. So,
And the state of Ohio is the only state in the United States that has that bill in place, which does not allow property taxes to grow with inflation.
Wow.
Right?
So
And so other states, they have very different mechanisms to manage the revenue of school districts, including at the discretion of the board or including some other ways to do that. But it's very unique in Ohio that that school districts don't generate more property tax revenue from inflation of house values. And it was an interesting move, and I think at a very high inflationary time like the 70s, and maybe like now, that's probably wise, right? And I think it's a functional part of our system now, that we have these conversations and we have the levy cycle that will exist for as long as we know, and including this, right? We're gonna have to keep going back to any incremental expenses justify our property tax, we'll have to go back to the voters for.
So does this mean that other states don't have to try to pass levies to grow?
Not in the same way that we do, but different states have different mechanisms to do that, right? You know, some states, I have people I know that are on boards of education where the Board of Education just elects what the tax rate should be, right? And that
Wow.
becomes a very dysfunctional situation because you have very divisive Board of Educations, right? Who have very different perspectives and so forth. So, I'm not sure if this is good or bad, it is what it is.
I hereby
Right.
declare
No,
your new
I-
tax rate.
No, thank you. I don't want to be the one on the board in that case.
All right, so then jumping into the assumptions on the income tax. So again, the income tax is growing from about 20% to 22% if it is renewed. And you can see this is where it's going to sharply drop off without the renewal, which is represented by the orange bars here. So the income tax adjusts with the economic conditions of the community. That's why it's allowing for some growth there. So we have included a 4% increase in each of the forecasted years. And while we have not had our income tax for a period of time to come up with historical trends, since we are a traditional tax base, we can look at the state of Ohio's total taxable income over 15 years, and it comes out to 4%. And that includes, recessions as well as positive economic conditions as well. So that is true average. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assumption. I'd also say that I would guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, in other school districts that have a balance of property tax and income tax, you see this fluctuation in what percent the income tax is, because the income tax is kind of moving up smoothly with inflation, whereas property tax stays stable and then increases.
Right.
Right, and so you probably have this fluctuation around 20%. So it'll go, if we were to pass a property tax at some point in the future, the percentage of our income tax would drop down maybe below 20%, depending on a lot of things, and then it would creep back up. So you
Yep.
will continue to see that cycle, is that probably?
Yes, yep, that is true. And when it comes to the point that we would need a new property tax, the income tax would continue to grow as a percentage of the total until we pass a new property tax, and then it would drop back down. Yep. Okay, and then the final, and this is not the final source, but those are just our three main sources of revenue that I wanted to highlight. The other two, public utility and property tax allocation, are all driven off the same assumptions as the property tax slide, so I didn't want to get into the details of that just for time's sake. But really quick on state funding, we are in the second year of the Fair School Funding Formula. And so we may see changes coming in the next biennium that should be proposed in February. I believe that process will start. But it's unlikely that any formula that is presented that the district is going to receive additional revenue. Because like we've talked about, the income and property values are always going to be some portion of any formula that's proposed. So they're taking into account your local capacity to fund your schools. That is the underlying piece of any of the formulas at the state level. So you can see the reduction that we saw in 2020 that I referenced. If we recall, they cut our funding in the last 2 months of the fiscal year, so that was great. And then we had the implementation of the funding formula in 22, which was significantly less than where we were before. But just as a reminder, that was a change to the way they funded students who were educating. So while we received less revenue, we also had offsetting reduction in our expenditures through tuition. So that wasn't a true reduction. We actually, I took the slide out this time because we talked a ton about it last year, but we actually saw an increase in our state funding a little bit because of the transportation component. So just wanted to highlight that we actually did benefit from the Fair School Funding Formula this go around, but we are on the guarantee. So you go through this complicated formula to come up with your numbers, but the formula is actually saying that we should receive less than what we are receiving because we're guaranteed to receive the same amount of funding that we got in '21. So if that guarantee were to go away, this line would decrease even more than, it's dropping slightly over the forecast period, but it would definitely decrease even more if that guarantee goes away.
Do you know what that number is, if the guarantee does go away, what that state funding equivalent would be?
We're about half, so our state funding would decrease by about half.
So we could lose half of our
Yeah.
budget.
Which is
That's it.
really already very minuscule.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a big percent, right? I mean, it's significant. There you go. Okay.
Okay, so then moving on to expenditures. So unlike on the revenue side, the graph on the left here that shows the breakdown of the expenditure categories and how they change over time, there's really not much change here. But the item to highlight is that salary and benefits make up 75 to 80% of our total budget. So when you're talking about expenditures are exceeding revenue by $2.9 million, well, this is what's driving a large majority of that. Over time, our historical change year over year has been about 2.8% increase each year, and we're forecasting almost 5.5% over the next 5 years. And actually, that's less than inflation is right now, which is pretty good. But I'll get into the details of those assumptions on each slide. So first, salaries. We have included in each year steps and inflationary adjustments. So we have a 3-year collective bargaining agreement in place. So that will carry us through fiscal year 2025. Then in 26 and 27, we have an inflationary adjustment that would be subject to the negotiation process. In addition to that, we have built in additional teachers and staff to accommodate the enrollment growth that we talked about. So if we're talking about 72 new students per year, that's about 3 teachers. So that's what we've included each year for the next 4 years. And this year we added two positions, both at the elementary. So that's included in 23, and then the 3 teachers for 24 through 27. Same impact on benefits, plus some, right? So as you add staff, you're adding most likely insurance plans to go on top of that, plus retirement and Medicare percentage of salaries. But medical insurance premiums are quite unpredictable and tends to increase at a rate higher than the rest of our other line items. However, I would like to give a huge recognition and kudos to everyone involved in the 8% reduction to our medical insurance premiums for 2023. That is huge and unheard of right now and should not be expected to continue. So we have an 8% reduction in our medical insurance premiums for 2023, an 8% cap for 2024. So when we're out in 2024, which crosses 24 and 25 on this graph, our medical insurance premiums will be no higher than they are today. So that's huge. That is due to the efforts of the collective bargaining process and plan design changes that we have implemented. It's also due to the fact that we go out and solicit bids. So our insurance consultant goes out and solicits bids from the insurance carriers to make sure that they're being competitive in the market. So we will continue to do that, but we have 10% then built out for 25 through 27. And then also through the collective bargaining process, we have made changes to the employee-employer premium share and HSA contribution adjustments as well to really keep this line item in check because it does tend to grow at the fastest rate of all the expenditure categories.
And I would again highlight how well that we have worked in collaboration with our staff to make this sustainable because, healthcare overall right now is really something which is facing huge inflation, and we had a system that was not sustainable going forward, and we've collaborated as best possible to find a way, and the staff has really stepped up, and our teachers have stepped up to find a way that we can continue to offer benefits to our staff. But it's been a lot of work on everyone's part, and I want to be thankful for that.
Okay, so then just highlighting all other expenditures, and I tried to pull out the largest individual line items out of all other expenses, because these really are going to be pretty strictly tied to inflation over time. So we have really increased what's in the forecast as far as additional growth beyond what our historical trend has showed us. So utilities are going up, our custodial maintenance contract is up for renewal this year, so that's our contract with ABM. Fuel, as everyone knows, our liability insurance, just textbooks, classroom supply, materials, those day-to-day things, land acquisition, as well as capital improvements. So these are all significant line items that are really going to be driven by inflationary growth over the next 5 years. Any questions on those? Okay. All right, so that brings us back to our summary graph. And just to kind of wrap things up here, again, the income tax represents 20% of our total operating revenue. And without that, the cash balance diminishes quickly. That's the red line here. To the point of negative $11 million in 2027 without that renewal. Expenditures, again, are increasing largely due to the enrollment growth we've talked about due to Intel and inflation. And maintaining a sufficient cash balance is vital during this period of high growth to allow us to adapt and respond to the changing conditions of the district. And having a cash balance allows us to be able to do that. Did I see somebody's hand?
Yeah,
Flash up.
2027 is really 2026, right?
It's 26, 27, so it's June, or July of 26 through June of 27.
Thank you, yes, this is 2022. Okay.
Yeah.
What, if any, regulatory restrictions are there on operating at a deficit like that?
Well, we couldn't.
Right, no, I
Yeah.
understand
Yeah.
that, but aren't there?
So at this point, when you even have a deficit in the individual year, that's when you start looking at needing new money. So if we jump back to this slide here that shows that individual year, that's when you start needing new money. When you're projecting a deficit cash balance, I believe in the next fiscal year, that's when it starts to become a real issue from a regulatory standpoint. So we would not be able to pass a forecast that included that.
Right, but at some point, doesn't oversight step in?
Like fiscal
Fiscal
watch
watch,
and all
yeah.
that, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's what
Yeah, do you know the specifics on when that kicks in? I don't know.
I don't.
I hope we never have to. do
I
that.
hope we never
I hope
have
I
to.
don't have to learn that.
Yeah, so if the levy doesn't pass in May, we would be dipping into our cash balance for the next fiscal year?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's not a good place to be.
Correct. Okay. Any other questions on the forecast?
No, that's great. Okay, we've reached the point in our agenda where we welcome public comments. If you have anything to say, please feel free to step to the podium, state your name and address, and feel free to address the board for up to 5 minutes. We might not have the opportunity to directly respond to your questions, but following public comment, we do have board discussion where we'll take that into mind, and we strive as well to get answers to all the questions that are posed by suggestions to our superintendent or others. So please, if there's anyone that has a message, please feel free to step to the podium and state your name and address.
I am Joe Curry, address 2647 Lowell Street. I took notes like my brain operates, so it's going to be a little choppy here.
That's okay.
First, I think it was the last thing you said, the levy in May. If the levy fails in May, it goes back to the ballot in November, right, before it's completely
Yeah, we will.
mixed.
We'll talk about that a little bit in board discussion, but we haven't made any assumptions yet about May or November and so forth.
Correct, but if it fails, it has to November. of 2023.
It expires in December 31st, 2023.
There you go. Some of the things about TIFs and JED. So the TIF, I'm doing a TIF right now, and the TIFs is designated how they are operated by the municipality. So I'm in the middle of a TIF currently, personally, and I'm getting TIFs on everything but the schools. So I still have to pay the schools right now. Negotiating between a 12-year TIF and a 15-year TIF. I can put you in contact with the municipality person I'm working with on that. It's in Ohio. And a JED is, I think you're right, it's not generating income personally, but what you're doing is you are allowing to spread out your tax where you were not getting taxes at before, and it's growth. So I'm a real estate investor, so my primary focus is, like, that's how I think and that's how I operate. So when you're talking about water and sewer, if you want to talk about water and sewer, Columbus City and Delaware, they put water and sewer everywhere, so they control everything that has their water and sewer. So I think that's a handicap that we're not doing now. Southwest Licking School, you guys think that's a bad thing? They seen this ball coming, for years. And not only does it do residential development, I think is what you see here, but it does commercial development too. So we've been a bed town. When I say we, Granville's been a bed town. There's not really much growth as far as commercial growth that has been in there. If you look at the history she showed, $500,000 a year in commercial growth, that's not a great number when you're trying to diversify your tax base. We're 90% residential, 10% commercial as a whole. So is there an avenue that's being discussed where maybe we lower the income tax to 0.5% and then we put a 0.25% for infrastructure growth on there? And then you go out and you put not only water and sewer, but Dublin is very active in putting fiber somewhere. And what is Intel, and you don't bring, Dublin does this certainly, you don't want to build in Dublin because the codes are terrible, but in Dublin, I'm probably going to run out of time here, in Dublin they only source companies that they want to bring there. So you're not going to see manufacturing, you're going to see medical, you're going to see high-end, high-office jobs there because they put fiber there and they attract the businesses that they want there. I think there's a lot of revenue to be had. So we got 10% currently commercial to 90% residential. What's that revenue base number? What does that revenue base number for taxes increase if we get into the Ohio standard, national standard of 25%? Is it 1 million now that we can get 2.5 million out of it per year? Does that dramatically decrease that $11 million loss? So you've seen in the slides the 60 homes being built every year, which I fully agree. That's coming. That is going to happen. But you didn't see it in the slides, any growth from commercial. You did a whole presentation and you got some company to go out and do that, which I think is great. But when you pulled from the commercial growth, you said, well, our history shows. We went from our history. If you look at the history of a 50-mile radius from Arizona, Prescott, wherever Intel went last, and look at a 50-mile radius, do you think that their growth, their commercial growth, stayed with their 500,000? Certainly it's not going to, and it's not going to now. I think that was, if it's less than 10 times that, 2 years from now, I'd be shocked. That one $5 million bill doesn't happen within the next 2 years. I'd be shocked if that didn't happen. Ronnie, you were talking about there's more state funding in the process right now. So there's other things going in the works that we don't know about. The backpack bill is sitting in-house committee right now. What does that look like? If we get the backpack bill, does that pull from our source of income? Are we putting 20-year tax? So in Park Trails, where I used to live, in Park Trails, there used to be a 20-year tax on this. Are we taxing all of our new homes? We have this green space in the community, and my understanding is the green space has a significant amount of money in it because they can't find space to buy, which is a huge problem. And I've tried to figure this out with state legislators. Per the code, it says to the beautification of something for Granville. So we're not sure if we can land grab in Union Township. It's a very gray area. But is that discussion being had at a legislative level to say, hey, we got a lot of money, we can't spend it. what does the beautification of Granville really mean? Can we land grab Union Township? Can we land grab these other townships? And we have a surplus of money, go there and buy them up. And then to limit growth, are we talking to our municipalities now, is that my 5 minutes? Are we talking to our municipalities now to increase the lot sizes? 2, 3, 5 acre lots, to limit the household growth, to limit the students that impact us?
That's a good point. Yeah. I will
Thank you.
address
Quite a few of those things during the
Yeah.
board discussion.
Thank you.
So stick around.
Great. Anyone else have public comment?
Well, I do.
Great.
I'm Dale Panko, 174 Lynn Terrace. And it sounded to me like you can go for a renewal. I guess one question I have, is it going to be a permanent renewal again? Or are you going to do a renewal?
Good question.
Good question.
I think that's something you ought to consider. The other thing is, I'd like you to consider earned income tax. I know you went through that before, and it went down, and you went to the total income. But the total income hurts the retirees, big time. And I'm a retiree. You exempt Social Security, but you don't exempt pension. And I'm a public employee. That's pension. We don't get Social Security. Teachers get pensions. They don't get Social Security. They're taxed. We're on fixed incomes. We do get some cost of living, but it's less than 3%. And I do mean less than 3%. I think we got 1.5% over the last year or two. So we're on fixed income, essentially, and you know where inflation's going. And we can't afford the taxes in this community as they are now. And you're putting a big burden on the retirees and anybody on fixed income. And so I had asked that you do it on total income and it be a renewable tax. The workers are going to get, you're talking about Intel coming and growth here. These are probably going to be people that are workers. And they're going to be the ones with kids. You said that yourself. You've got, 72 students to 60 households. They're the users of your facilities, of your education. They should be paying the way. We had kids that went to Granville schools and we paid their way through our property taxes over the 4 or 8 years they went here. We can't do that anymore. We don't have any kids in school. We're not users of the facility. Yes, we may benefit from property taxes. Well, if that's the case, then make your case for property levies. Increases for workers are going to be a lot more than they are for retirees. And we're stretched as it is. And, if you're going to get increases for workers that are working, then do the earned income, not total. That's all I have. I hope you give it strong consideration and take us into a factor with that, and go back and propose the earned income tax. And I realize the percentage is different, but that's the way it is. If you're trying to meet your budgets and your growth, do it that way. But please don't burden the retirees and those on fixed income. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Panko. Anyone else? Great. Great, well, thank you for your comments, and we welcome comments from other individuals in the community by email or phone. Our numbers and contact information is on the website, and you're always welcome. We'll move into a part of our agenda now for a board discussion, which certainly includes a levy discussion, and a lot that we've kind of learned from that, and our first chance to speak at the board since last Tuesday. I'm not sure that we can fully answer all the questions that have been posed, because this is really our first chance to get into this, but we will again strive to make sure that we have answers and responses to those, and might choose to meet one-on-one or have some other meetings with the community in general to pass along information. I wouldn't mind having a couple other updates before we get into the levy discussion, though, because although that's been a lot of our conversation these last couple of months, there's been a lot of other exciting things happening, and I wanted to just kind of reference a couple of those. First of all, the commendations are wonderful, but that's just scratches the surface of all the great things that our students are doing between the other athletic achievements this fall and performances in the theater and the music and things. I wish we could have all those kids here, but that's been really wonderful. I'll also mention I attended a World Class Education Committee meeting, and this is a community group that gets together. It was a fantastic session where we reviewed the Janet grant and our drive for student-determined learning, and that was just really encouraging to see. We probably had 10 community members attend to really help us think through, the curriculum of the future, and it was really inspiring to see that kind of level of dedication and the really different kind of ideas that are coming our way that we can significantly use to engage students in a better way. I know, Jeff, you're a big fan of this and so forth.
Sure.
And I'll let you put in a quick plug for that, but that was just really neat, because that's the first time I attended a World Class Education meeting in probably 5 years since I was on that committee before.
Yeah, I think the exciting aspect of giving students more autonomy over their learning is it is an actual pathway to help mental health as well. So thinking about ways that we can develop agency, autonomy in our educational experience, so that students walk out having not just played the real world, actually done the real world learning. So yeah, good stuff.
Okay. I'll also bring up the fact that many of us on the board attended the Licking County All Boards Dinner Meeting, which is a meeting of all boards of education of all Licking County school districts. And it was really good to kind of get together with that group. We haven't in the past had occasions enough to work collaboratively with our surrounding districts, but I think our administration, the superintendents and treasurers have really showed us the model these last couple of years as they've been sort of forced to work together, but really embrace that opportunity. I truly believe that finding a way to reach out to other school districts around our county is going to be critical to managing growth. Because just with municipalities, if they're kind of fighting against each other for businesses or things like that, it's just not going to work out well. I think there's a great opportunity for school districts to collaborate, and I felt a willingness for them to do that. Different school districts around our county have very different challenges than we do. There are school districts that have doubled in size because of water and sewer availability and are struggling to kind of keep up with that. There are school districts that have enormous land, right, from anywhere from some school districts of 10 square miles to some of 140. And those giant school districts are largely not built out right now, right? And with the growth that's expected in their backyard, they're going to see incredible changes in the landscape of their enrollment. So they have very different challenges. We will see enrollment growth, but nowhere near the kind of magnitude and the challenges that many other school districts will have. So it was good to get together with that group, and I think that more that we can do to encourage that kind of inter-district collaboration, the better. And the last meeting that I've attended in the last month was our Strategic Growth Task Force. We had an update where we shared these enrollment kinds of numbers. We also broke out into smaller groups with focuses on things like facilities and like the fiscal impact of this growth and so forth. And it was great to see those community members really engaged. We are so fortunate to have really high caliber professionals in our community that care about our schools and the sustainability of our community overall. To see these folks come in with financial experience and development experience and give us some guidance so we can make these assumptions about what's the correct growth rate was really helpful. That group is going to continue to be important, right, and hopefully come up with some conclusions in the next, 4 to 6 months that will guide us for our long-term planning and so forth. So that's just kind of a list of a few of the meetings that I've attended, and I'm not sure if there's others that have attended some of our booster meetings or other groups that have anything to say before we jump into the levy discussion.
I want to talk a little bit about the book club, or the book study that I was part of. So we were reading How to Raise an Adult, and it ties in perfectly with students having more autonomy and being more responsible for their education process, and like what they want to focus on will help them have more interest in it, and then they'll learn how to do things for themselves. So anyway, we're almost wrapping that up. There's still 2 more meetings if anybody wants to join. It's called How to Raise an Adult, and I am meeting on Wednesday and then the 29th. So.
Great, thanks for the update. It's a great book. It's really kind of cool to see so many of our community members engaged in that book study. I think that's a great process that we've done with staff, and the board has been gifted with some copies of books as well that have been really enlightening. So thanks for keeping that up and connecting with folks there. Okay, so relative to the levy, Jeff, I'm not sure if you want to start out with answering some questions or frame our discussion a little bit and so forth. But if
I think we're gonna, meet offline as well. So if we can talk more at length about these little answers, and Brittany calibrate for me. So first of all, the backpack bill. Backpack bill will also be subject to reduction factors. So they might identify an amount that goes into the backpack, but it will still have a relative wealth and income wealth reduction. So it doesn't really matter, how that is packaged. There's going to be some type of reduction for our school district wealth. I think that's not necessarily something that would be advantageous for us. Community authorities. So a community authority like we have for park trails was a special assessment that was assessed on every home from the minute it was built and occupied for 20 years. Those are starting to sunset. That is something that is something that we can advance as a school district, but a developer does not have to agree to. So it is, part of a, collaboration to try and help build a residential development into an environment and offset the cost of students coming, but it is not something that we can force. That is something that has been tried in other residential communities. Even Park Ridge, right across the street, does not pay the community authority that Park Trails pays. So just to clarify that from a community authority. It sounded like you were confusing some of the abilities of a school district versus a municipality. So when it comes to TIFs, municipalities drive the TIF. We do not have any say in the TIF. We can be part of the conversation. We are guaranteed 25% of the revenue that's generated. They can take 75% with or without our approval. But that's a municipality decision.
And there may be like payments in lieu of taxes.
Correct.
If we are at a table or if the parties are favorable to that, and of course we would always ask and want that to be on the table, but again, it's not guaranteed.
And generally, the terms of those are highly dependent on the type of infrastructure and growth that's desired. So for example, for the residential growth, we would really struggle with a TIF.
Yes.
Because we can't deal with, with all those extra students coming in and all the residential development. We wouldn't want to not have any of that school district tax. However, for commercial development, that would come in and not bring students or cost to our district. If it's overall strategically appropriate for the community, we could consider supporting that. Yeah. Right? So basically, I guess the guideline is like never TIF a residential development. Right. Probably should say in public or whatever, but like you just don't TIF a residential development. Right. Commercial development's another question, right? And if you utilize that land space for some valuable resource for the community, and it brings in employees who become a functional part of the community and so forth, maybe there's a story there. But that's something that's looked at on a case-by-case basis, and really something the school district has very, very little control over, like many of these things, in the hands of the municipalities primarily.
Yeah, and we have had several successful TIF conversations with the village. The orthopedic center at the corner of Newark Granville and Thornwood Crossing, that was TIFed for a short period of time. Again, high value from a commercial standpoint, low expenditure from a student perspective, no students. And obviously Otterbein had a TIF involved, but it's a negotiation. The good news is we have really good relationships with the municipalities to have those conversations, but we are not the driver in those discussions. The other thing, you had mentioned Southwest Licking. Southwest Licking that we're talking about is actually the water provider, not the school district. So the water provider has been granted these authority, or the authority to expand, not the school district. Municipalities are quite independent in their abilities to do certain things. We have great relationships with Union, Granville, and the village, but townships don't necessarily have the ability to stop municipalities from annexation. So there is threat of annexation in Union Township. We've talked about that quite a bit. We are 90-10. This board, previous boards, since I got here 12 years ago, that was one of the first things that we brought to the village to talk about, which was economic development. We see the lack of sustainability with 90-10. We're trying to get dirt moved. There needs to be a major muscle movement in the area of commercial development, because we can't always just keep placing it on the backs of residential taxpayers. So we understand those needs. Unfortunately, we can't extend water and sewer. That's not our job. Our job is to educate.
Can I give a little plug there?
Yeah.
So Jim Leonard is coming to the village, my understanding is that Jim Leonard is coming to the village council meeting this Wednesday to present what he shared with the Chamber of Commerce at the Chamber Luncheon last month. So there will be some economic development discussion at the village council meeting this week.
And I would also say we've done a pretty thorough land analysis and real estate availability analysis for commercial development specifically, and this has been done many times over the last 20 or 40 years, right? And even with significant commercial development, there's just not that much space that's available, right? There's just really very little acreage that suits itself to commercial development in our current school district boundaries. So I would love to move that needle, right? And, you know, and if we multiply by 10 times the amount of commercial development in the past, it might move the needle a little bit. But in reality, there's not a lot of space for it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't start. That doesn't mean we don't need to think very intentionally as a community, which is mostly out of the control of the school district. It's mostly within the purview of the village of Granville to extend water and sewer, and the townships that we collaborate with to come up with mechanisms such as JEDs and CRAs to facilitate that and inspire that kind of development. Yeah.
Can I address one thing? Mr. Curry, okay. So what I said about the Ohio School Boards Association trying to advocate for more state funding, that is just, I mean, we're not being realistic. It's not anywhere close to passing right now. So we can't even think about relying on that at this point. I really hope it passes, but this is something that I feel like if the entire community of Granville wrote to our legislators and said, listen, this is not fair that we're getting taxed so heavily because we're considered a wealthy district. You know, we're feeling taxed out, which I totally understand. I feel like if we could all contact our legislators, they might consider this, because it's just not, we just don't have fair funding, really.
Are there more on your list?
Just a couple of things, you know, just to add some context to the other gentleman. When the earned income tax failed, it was 1.25, which would generate roughly the same amount as the all income 0.75. So the feedback that was heard at that time was, you know, expand it to the entire community and lower the rate. That's what they did, and that's what passed. You know, property tax is, you know, we're still 58% reliant on our property tax as well. So the effort to put the income tax in place was to diversify the revenue streams so that we could have some incremental growth based on the economic conditions of the community, assuming that, if the community is doing well and adjust, we benefit, bank, and use for future and delay any future requests for new money. And then if the community is struggling from a financial standpoint, we struggle as well, and we, adjust our budget accordingly. So, but a lot of those conversations, have been had and will need to be had again here shortly to kind of think about where to go. I think the board, I know the administration heard that the permanency was the issue, and in that levy failure on Tuesday. And so I think, it would be wise for the board to consider a different option that does not have a permanent aspect to it.
And I'll point out, this is
Leads to the conversation.
the first time we've had this conversation as a board and things like that. We've certainly all talked to individual constituents. So I'd love to hear from all of you kind of what your feedback was since Tuesday. And I'd also like to encourage us all to continue to reach out because we have some important decisions to make about what the right plan forward is. And at this point, we don't have any plans. We had a scenario model with the income tax continuing, but maybe it's a different mechanism, maybe it's a different length, and so forth. So I'm encouraged to hear.
Can I just go back maybe to the time that you put that levy on the ballot? Because I think it's important to understand that conversation that led to the current initiative or the failed initiative. So when we talked and put the November ballot issue on the ballot, it was really,
In May. This year.
This year.
This year.
Thank you.
The board really looked at the sustainability of the need, and that's why the permanency kind of resonated. In ballot language, it's called continuing, but it's the same thing. But really, the need would not go away for that revenue stream based on our growth. And that's, ultimately why that decision was made at that time. The decision was, either permanent or 10-year. And ultimately, we did have conversation about 5-year and how that would be complicated because you would likely have a bond issue and a renewal in very short time frames within a 5-year period of time. So that's why the 10-year and
property tax,
potentially a property tax. So that you could have seen layering of levies within a short-term period of time, which would not be advantageous from a stability standpoint. That's why the permanent and 10-year became the best options, and you chose permanent at that time. So that's to frame the conversation that you're about to have, just reiterating what happened several months ago.
So facility building, is that would be a bond for that?
Correct, right, and I always assumed that we would need another building at some point in time because our enrollment has been.
Or two.
Or two, right, but
I mean,
I've
we're
always
getting
kind of thought of
really
it as
close
one,
at
right?
GES, yeah.
Right, and so I think this is going to accelerate the conversation about that and also extend it to thinking more strategically long-term instead of incremental, right? And that's really what the goal of, one of the goals of the strategic task force is to come back based on this enrollment forecast, based on land availability, and give us some recommendations, right, that we can act on likely in the spring to be able to move forward with a facility model effectively.
Yeah, thank you. And because we have to get on land acquisition relatively soon for a 5-year plan, we are looking at a bond somewhere, like when would we need the bond for that?
So I would say at the latest, we would be trying to secure bond for a new building by, at the latest, 2025.
And that includes land acquisition?
That would include land acquisition. Typically.
And is that 24?
And land acquisition can happen before a bond. We can use operating funds to purchase land if necessary prior to a bond to create a building.
And is that the 24-25 school year?
That would be 20, it could be either 24, 25, or 25, 26. I'm not tying myself to, yeah. I'm good at predicting, but I'm not that good.
Okay.
So,
In reality, we have to be responsive, right? We have to like see what's gonna happen, and are there budget developments popping up, or is the timing to get things like water and sewer in place extending because of all the delays in construction and so forth? So we just have to be in a position that we'll be able to be responsive to whatever those needs are and get the long lead times items taken care of first.
Yeah, I just worry about land not being available.
Yes,
And
Yeah.
inflation.
correct.
And so then we'll
Yeah.
be doubling our costs, we're limited to location and size. And these are all very important factors, as we saw with the buildings that we built out, the intermediate school. So,
Correct. Yeah.
got to take all of that into
Yeah,
consideration.
we will compete in the same market as real estate developers
Mhm.
for land acquisition. We don't get a special place at the table.
However, I had similar feelings about voter fatigue, I guess, is something we talked about. However, it sounds like from what I heard from voters is that they want to be involved and they want to be at the ballot often. So maybe that's what we need to do then. Maybe this is a town where we don't have voter fatigue. I mean, we're a very active town, and elections are very important to most people. So we can vote on school board members, we can vote on bonds, we can vote on levies. We can vote every year. Is that too, maybe that's a little much, but, I mean, that's what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing people say, I want to put in place this funding mechanism for the long haul because I want our schools to have this kind of guaranteed income. I'm hearing people say, I want to be responsible for our taxes and I want to make sure that we're holding everyone accountable. I don't think it's the best way to run a school, but if that's what the community wants and we want to get a levy passed, then and we want to get bonds passed and we want to get things passed.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, and I mean, we can talk about what we hear talking to people. It was, for me, we heard a message on election day. And so I think we need to respect that as we go forward. I tend to agree with Cecile that, maybe from a planning perspective, it's a little tougher, but, we're elected by folks. So if I have no problem with the participation of the community, I think that's great. And for me, that's what I took away from the message.
Just to be clear though, I think many people I talk to who are worried about this levy passing, a levy passing, they will support the schools no matter what, but they don't feel like the whole community is in that same boat. So, and we have a whole community that votes, we have a whole community that we have to, be accountable to, and.
Yeah, historically, it seems like we've run the levy cycle on a roughly 5-year schedule, right? So we have the option when we need new property taxes, which happens in the levy cycle, to scale that levy to last as long as we want, right? So I don't know, last property tax levy was 10 years ago, was 6 mils or something like that, I'm guessing. I don't know, 5.8 was pretty close. And so, I mean, there's no reason that if we need an incremental property tax, we couldn't ask for 2 mils, and then it would last for 2 years, and ask for 2 mils again, and ask for 2 years, and ask for 2 mils again, right? Or we could vote on the income tax every however many years we want to vote on the income tax, and so forth. And I think it's kind of a balance of, like, basically how often we want to have this discussion, right? Is this a useful discussion every year? Well, we have a discussion with the board twice a year, and every month on things and so forth. but as a community, you know, is every year the right time to pass a levy? Right, or is every 2 years? Like, so if we put the income tax on for 5 years, right, we would have an income tax within 5 years, a bond within 5 years, and probably a property tax within 5 or 6 years, because that's when the revenue shows it's declining, right? So that's every 2 years. Is that the right frequency, or how do we determine that? Yeah.
I'm also curious, Mr. Brown, when you're looking at the running of a schools, and when you're looking at hiring, how does it look when a community is not passing levies or having to go back every 2 years? Or, I mean, and what we have to consider, of course, that there's growth. So people coming to Granville are going to know, oh, there's growth. So of course, things are going to be, there will be changes, and it'll be a time period where we do have to look for new money. But in that scenario of, we go back to the taxpayers every 2 years, what does that look like in terms of your work and the work of teachers?
Well, in practicality, in the operation of the school district, it will stunt innovation because we can't rely on a steady revenue stream to augment programs or anything like that. We're not going to do something temporarily if we can't sustain it. From a staffing standpoint, it diminishes our place within the marketplace. You know, Licking County, we tend to have the market share as far as hiring practices. We are 10 to 15% below Franklin County from a salary perspective. We lose people to Franklin County. We will lose people from this last election loss because they will not wait till May to put their resumes out there. They will go get different jobs if they know that they're going to be at risk. So we will already have a loss from the current levy situation. That's the reality of the hiring and recruitment and retention environment. So teachers are just like everyone else. They're going to look for stability, and they're going to look for where can I count on stable funding. I mean, Heath has 50% commercial.
Wow.
So Heath will be more stably funded than Granville schools. And I hate to use them as an example, but they're right next door. So they have a stability because of a commercial infrastructure base that we don't enjoy. And so, again, teachers are going to look for stability and where they can rely on the community support.
And I guess when it comes to kind of this levy cycle or voting on levies, whatever sort they might be and things like that, the thing that really strikes me hard is the magnitude of this one, right? I think that if the community can't support an incremental property tax, right, then the school district can't grow programs and can't grow staffing to meet enrollment growth. If the school district has 20% of our revenue pulled out, right, that's a very different situation, right? And that's a very different look and feel to it. So by putting 20% of your revenue on a renewing basis, you're really kind of jerking the lever back and forth on a whim to some extent, because it's just very difficult to manage through that, right? And have the certainty that you can continue to have staff, right? Or programs and things like that. So I struggle with that with 20% of our revenue. I think there's accountability that's absolutely required through the levy cycle and through board elections and through, you know, all that we do here. But I struggle with the magnitude of that impact, you know, should for some reason it not pass for a couple levy cycles.
The other thing that I think it's important for the board to know is that if you were to put a 10-year renewal on the ballot, you still have the ability by resolution to reduce that rate at points. If, let's say it over collects, okay? I mean, totally hypothetical. Did you hear that, Maria? Totally hypothetical. But let's say the income in this community, you know, grows at 25% for 7 years in a row, okay? And the board can adjust the rate down to 0.5%. Without a vote. Yeah.
So that, wait,
You have the ability by resolution to reduce the rate and then restore it back to the original level if necessary. You have some ability to adjust that as a board.
Okay, so just the 5 of us
Correct.
have that ability. It's not necessarily something that we would have.
That's not a referendum.
Yeah, and annually, we have to certify rates of both property tax
Correct.
and income tax. And in the past, we have a
The
history.
property tax is certified annually, the income tax, once it's passed.
Oh, we can make a
So-
resolution.
You would
Yeah,
have
so
to-
you would make a resolution to reduce the rate of the income tax if you wanted to. It would stay at that rate until you wanted to adjust it again, and you'd pass another resolution. The property tax is an annual
So it wouldn't take a
process.
community referendum or another vote to reduce the income tax rate, it would take a vote by the board.
What about,
And we have done that before with property taxes.
Right.
When we passed the income tax, we chose to eliminate a property tax, right? Not to not renew a property tax, which shifted the balance more toward this current balance that we have of 20% income tax. So it's not unproven that we've done that before.
And Brittany, just so the board has all the information, just talk a little bit about the process that we have to go through for certification for the May election if they were going to put something on.
Yeah, so the timing of that in alignment with our established board meetings. It's a two-step process for that resolution. So the first resolution would need to be passed at our December meeting, and then the second resolution would be passed at our January meeting for a May issue.
Thank you.
yeah, I would like to address the, sorry?
Mr. Penko.
Mr. Penko's topic about taxing retirees, because we discussed this a couple meetings ago, about how do we retain people, 55 and over. We don't want to see people moving out of our district when they don't have kids in the district anymore. It's advantageous for us to keep our retiree community. So is there a way we can think about that on this?
I think that's really important, right? And going back 5 years to when we instituted the balance of income and property tax, retirees were an important part of our thought process, right? Because we know that when you retire, your house property taxes don't go down, right? But your income likely does, right? And so the balance that we currently have of income and property tax is specifically to the benefit of retirees as opposed to an all property tax model. True that an earned income tax might be more so, but an income tax instead of the alternative of property tax is a significant benefit that we've heard back from retirees that they appreciate and will help them be active members of our community instead of forced to move away. So I think that just the concept of income tax is a really important one, and we went through these conversations 5 years ago, not just from a retiree perspective, but also from a commercial development perspective, relying solely on property tax. Taxes significantly commercial establishments that might come, right, which puts an even higher bar, right, to the ability for commercial development in Granville. So income tax, whether it be all income or earned income or whatever, has a benefit both to retirees and to commercial development, which we felt at the time was worth diversifying our revenue stream. So that's an important point that we need to make sure we reiterate.
Is there data to show what retirees were paying when it was all property tax versus the combined income and property tax? Like, I know the percentages are off, but I mean, like total cash amount annually.
Very different for different individuals, I would imagine.
Yeah,
but-
that's hard
but they're-
because that's an individual situation, and hands down, the biggest issue with the income tax is that we don't handle the collections of that ourselves. So we have very, very high level information on the income tax, so we don't have any individual taxpayer information.
Okay.
I would like to make a point that I don't think we have yet, which is that I don't think that the continuing nature was the only reason that the community felt that it was safe to vote this down. This was asking for the renewal a year ahead of time, and I think a fair number of people thought, well, there's no harm in voting it down right now, because they've got another year to get it passed. And I think they didn't understand the real costs of that happening. one aspect of it. If we continue to have to go back to the voters on a regular basis with a property tax followed by an income tax, followed by a bond issue, it takes an enormous amount of time for the treasurer and the superintendent to help educate the public. That's maybe invisible to the community, but it's an amazing time suck. And if they're not available to provide solid information, then we get misinformation, and people don't understand why we don't put things on that we don't need. I mean, we just don't. Also, with property taxes, my recollection is that if one is not approved, the next time you go back, and this wouldn't be the case for an income tax, but with the property tax, you're likely going to need to ask for more next time. The millage would be higher to make up for the length of time that you're, and the dollars that you're not collecting.
That is correct.
The final hidden cost of not having passed this request, and it may not be a factor yet, but if it were to recur, I have a feeling it would. Our bond rating is going to determine how much it costs us to build, and if we had significant levels of levies being declined, it's going to cost us dollars. It just is going to be more expensive.
Yeah, most people don't realize that Moody's rates us annually and looks at our fiscal status and says, okay, how much cash do you have on hand? You know, what's your levy support? How does your community support you? Because they're going to sell our bonds to municipal bond buyers.
Right.
And if we don't have stability in funding, then yes, we will likely lose our AA rating, which is tangible dollars to taxpayers.
Right.
So that is something that we haven't necessarily talked about, the impact of,
I think a lot
because
of
we haven't
people-
been building.
No, but I think a lot of people thought, oh, they've got plenty of time to pass this, and there's no harm in just saying, hey, and I don't see how we could be more transparent. I mean, all of our information is out publicly. We're lauded every single year by the state auditor for how good our financial records are. There are a lot of issues that I've got with the misinformation that was floating around, but it's the hidden costs of having thought that it was safe to say, no, not this time. It wasn't safe. It's costing dollars.
So I think one of the things that Brittany alluded to in the five-year forecast was the $2.9 million deficit spend. Our practice has always been to eliminate any deficit spending in the forecast as much as possible if we don't have the securing of additional funds. So that $2.9 million will become a topic of conversation that would occur before any new dollars could be generated. So I think that is something to continue to think about in the context of next steps.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty short term that we're going to need some sort of feedback on this.
I mean, just to be
together.
completely clear and transparent, I think what I'm hearing is that if this would not pass in May, we would need a list, the board would need a list the next day as to what might need to be cut, because we will have to make that decision. And
Which is not atypical. That's exactly what happened the last time.
And we have a
And
recovery
what-
from that.
Right. I think what we need is sort of a list over the next month, right? To come up with an understanding of what that looks like for a school district. So I'd kind of like to make the request to kind
Even
of.
earlier, okay.
Yeah, it's not, we're not going to wait till after May to figure this out, right? We really have to get this behind us now. I really, a cut list is a horrible thing, and I don't know how to communicate that or whatever, but we need to, as a board, understand what's at risk, right? So we can make the decision on the right levy to put on and the way that we need to get the community support. But to be clear, we can't run without money, right? And so if if we put on the income tax levy at the same level that it is right now, and it does not pass in May, it would have drastic influences with immediate cuts, right? And the risk of that means that even before then, we're gonna have challenges with recruiting. Like, I can't think of a year that we haven't had to hire 10 teachers because of retirements and because of enrollment growth and because of other changes in programmatic and so forth, right? It's really challenging in March or April to go out and recruit a teacher, not knowing if you're going to be able to recruit that teacher or not. It's really challenging. Retain that
Much
teacher.
less retaining the good teachers.
Much less retaining the ones that you have, right? So we're already in this kind of risk situation where we are going to have a challenge in a hard hiring environment, right? When we have less teachers going to the professor and less key people and things like that. But we need to have kind of that understanding now, so I'm gonna ask that you help us kind of pull that together and maybe communicate individually a little bit along those lines, what that magnitude might look like. Yeah.
But you estimated prior to the election that it represented roughly 35 positions, correct?
Yes,
So that
well,
was-
that was a total,
So 20% of our number of teachers is 35
Yeah.
teachers. So the problem is, when you get into a reduction of force situation, you're taking the lower paid
Lowest.
teachers, so it actually would equate in reality to a different number, yes, more.
now remember, typically, and we can get into further discussion later down the road about reduction in force, but typically, we impact all facets of the organization. So, you know, I will look at the 2.9, I'll come back and talk in generalities of the different areas, and then as we get further down the road, we'll bring more clarity to that.
And I would say, you know, include other financial recommendations that you would have to make up that $2.9 million deficit. Over the last few years, the board has eliminated largely the fees for pay to participate. We've eliminated the fees for technology. We've eliminated a lot of the participation in extracurricular fees that I think need to come back in force or more, you know, so that we don't impact the primary learning of kids in the classroom. So we just have to prioritize the learning in the classroom, and that means there's a lot of other pain points in the organization that deal with that, busing and, you know, whatever those things are. But I think we relatively short term need at least a summary of that. And of course, over the course of this whole year, that will have to be evolved. So I know it's going to be a big part of our work for the next 6 months to really scrutinize that and understand it, because we need to have that plan in place.
But I would like to make sure that you all know that you have to actually talk a little bit more about what you want to put on the ballot.
Right, that's
Yeah, because that,
So can we go back in time a little bit, and can you all remind me, when we decided to go, in 2018, we did the earned income tax, it did
at
not.
1.25.
At 1.25, then we reduced it down, but we did it all income tax.
Correct.
Can you all remind me why, how did we, I was involved in all those conversations, I cannot remember, like, why did we go there? You know what I mean?
We had a community forum,
Yes,
and we brought people in, and the feedback was lower the rate, have everyone pay. And that was the feedback. Just like the feedback was eliminate permanent, you know, come back with a different option other than permanency. You know, the feedback at that time was lower the rate and have more people pay.
so does anyone at the table, are we hearing, or have you heard, you know, that you know, something different than the 0.75 income tax, besides the permanent issue?
Dollar amount, percentage amount.
Like percentage amount, earned income, anything different around that? Or has it just been the permanent, the continuing?
I would say from individual members of the community, I've heard lots of different things. Some people that might be a very high income say, oh, you should be all property tax. Let's go back to all property tax,
Okay.
right? Because that's more advantageous to them individually. You know, some people think that an earned income is better. Some people would like just a lower rate of the existing and so forth. And some people question whether our expenses are correct. Oh, you should just live with 20% less. What's that look like? Right? And I've heard a lot of that feedback, like, oh, this is not a big deal. You know, you didn't have this 5 years ago, so you don't need it. Right? And so I think we need to be real clear in understanding what this pays for, right? And what this does. And curiously enough, in this whole levy conversation, we just never had a conversation about the quality of the schools, right? And we also never had hardly any conversation about the cost, right? Because we have an awesome product for a fantastic cost relative to our comparable districts. So that was sort of just curiously off the table. It's that's the core of what we're doing, right? We're providing great education. If we're not providing good education, you should vote no. Are we spending too much? You should vote no, right? But both of those were off the table. And I really heard about the concerns of accountability, permanence, right, were the primary things that came up. I didn't hear people complain about Granville schools. I didn't hear them say oh, you're not giving a good enough product, right? That was just not on the table. And even on the cost side, again, that's what school districts fight in the levy cycle, right? And that's the right thing to be fighting for, right? If you're not doing a good product, or you're spending too much and not getting it worth, right? You should have community members that are complaining about paying more taxes, right? But we got, I think, sidetracked from that conversation around language of permanence. So I think, in my opinion, that's the primary thing we need to address. And I would say from a time frame perspective, we need to talk to a lot more community members. I have grave concerns with overly engaging voters in this process. If we have to be on every other year, that gets a little tiresome, that gets a little costly, especially looking at the next few years, given the known growth that we have. 10 years from now, I don't quite know what that growth is going to look like and so forth, but we will have gone through this process for a while. I have big concerns of a 5-year renewal because of the other known factors that we know are going to happen in the next 5 years. And putting this amount at risk in that kind of time frame is a real challenge for me. That's why we thought that continuing it or making it permanent was the right thing. But I think it takes more community conversations. Possibly we should hold a work session, in 2018 between the first and second levy requests. We had a work session. We engaged a lot of community members. So I guess we all as board members need to go out and engage folks in the community and ensure we can understand where they're coming from. Because I'm not sure we've heard anything, and you had good points about, it's not a problem if it doesn't pass, right? If that was the only concern, we need to make sure we're clear in our communications on that, right? If the perspective is, you don't need that much money, right? You already have too much, we need to make sure we're clear of what the implications are of 20% of our budget.
I think it's good to go back to retention. It's not a light issue if we're not retaining our teachers. And I think we're not giving enough credit to the quality of our education, to the excellent teachers we have who are getting paid less than equally highly performing districts. We're only keeping them because we have such a great community with great kids and great administration. And if we have issues retaining these teachers because they're not sure if they're gonna, have a stable job in a year or two, we're gonna lose the quality of our education. And we know that from a whole child perspective, having a bond and relationship with a teacher and having this sense of community with teachers is almost as important as whatever the curriculum is that they're learning, because they need to have somebody that they can bond with and trust and talk with and, engage with. And if we're having a high rate of turnover, it's just not going to look the same. It's not going to look like the Granville School District that we all grew up with. So I think that's a really important point to consider in terms of 5-year versus 10-year,
So I'm sorry, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, the need is not going to go away and it is not going to decrease. And it's possible that 10 years, if we were to put it on in May for 10 years, that 10 years down the road, 0.75 might not be adequate.
Or it might be too much.
Continuing.
It's hard to know.
Who knows?
Yeah.
So ultimately, we need to ask the board attorney to draft some options for December, as Brittany outlined, so, let's say you, as far as direction.
I mean,
Well, before this levy, we asked them to, and correct me if I'm wrong, we asked them to do
We had
continuing.
we had a resolution for 10-year and a
Yeah.
resolution for continuing, and y'all clarified during the board discussion
Right.
to go with the continuing. So we could have 2 or more resolutions drafted to be ready to go.
I mean, I would suggest a 5-year and a 10-year resolutions, like we did for this recent election, and then, you know, that gives us time to reach out in the community and talk to people and come back and decide from there, but that's my thought on it.
And I guess I really wish I had more information from the community members, because I must have had 20 talks with people since Tuesday and things like that, but that's like not enough, right? And we need to find ways to get more of that in there. And I don't know if there are even other mechanisms, like if 8-year a thing, I don't know, right? So it seems like we need to still continue to do some research on what's happening here. And maybe we could put those 2 resolutions on, but possibly we can make that request. Can we make that request at a different time for what to put on the agenda? Or can you bring to us a recommendation, or does it need to be today that we say exactly what we're gonna put on the ballot?
No, the resolution is the resolution of necessity. So that's just the heading on the agenda. And then during the board discussion of that agenda item, you would clarify what the term is.
Oh, okay, so we can
And for my,
put on,
excuse me,
okay.
my own clarification, we have to do it by January for the May.
Yeah, the second
From a second
resolution
reading, yeah.
would need to be passed
Right.
at our January meeting.
Right, can't be any later.
Correct.
Are we-
Uh,
So we have to be
Well,
on the
to
agenda.
clarify, based on our existing board meeting schedule. So we could
Okay.
have had a special meeting in January and done 2 resolutions, both of them in January. So the actual deadline is, I think, February 2nd to pass the
Okay.
second resolution, but our February meeting is later in the month.
Right,
I just wanted
gotcha.
to make that crystal
Right,
clear.
right.
Can I recommend that we ask for a resolution to be drafted at a rate of 0.75% all income for a term to be determined after we do more research and communication and listening to the community, or is that not possible to have that?
No. You
And
have
are
to
we-
pass the resolution with the terms that would be on the ballot.
Right, so we can, but in the next meeting, can we not put that term in the resolution?
Yeah, that's what we would do. So we're gonna have,
Okay.
yeah,
In December.
Is
Are
that
we
enough
considering,
guidance?
yes.
sorry,
Okay.
are we considering any change to percentages or like excluding retirees or adjusting percentages for people on pensions or?
You can't have variable rates.
Okay.
I think that increasing the rate to 1.25% and changing the tax base is something that the community already pretty clearly told us they're not interested in.
Was that at the forum or was that actually put on the ballot?
Oh, so I don't know.
Yeah, that was the
Yeah.
one that we lost.
Yeah, and was discussed before, right? So we
Right.
last time when we didn't pass, we got the meeting together, we said, why didn't it pass? Right,
Right.
and that was the feedback we got that was relatively clear, in which case they passed the continuing, or the 5-year all-income levy.
Right, thank you.
And what was it, what was the suggestion, 1 point what?
Yeah,
We
we
were
just-
on the ballot for 1.25 earned income.
Earned.
It did not pass. The community forums said the reason it didn't pass and the thing they would support was a 0.75% all income.
And
So that's what got us to where we are today.
curiously, we heard from retirees saying they didn't think it was fair that they weren't going to pay.
I do remember that.
Everybody's got
I do remember that.
different perspectives.
Yeah. I
We
do
accept
want
donations.
to, retain our retirees. I think that's like,
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's an
why
important part of the
we
income tax, absolutely.
Income tax in the first place.
That's right.
is there a way to like adjust the ratio of
Even the-
income to property?
there's a lot of constraints, even like if, 0.6% would be better. Right, well, you can't do
I think we have
0.6%,
to
it has to be
quarter.
0.5 or 0.75.
Oh,
There's
that's
a
what
lot
I
of,
was gonna ask.
we can't pick this kind of income and not that kind of income. We can't give different grants and things like that. We're very limited in the number of knobs and options that we have, but I'm open to suggestions.
Is
Ready.
0.5 all income and increasing property, is there somewhere we could work with that, or is that not what the community wants?
That'd be
So-
two, would that be two
Pass
separate?
two
It could,
levies.
but
Separate
these,
things.
Ooh, I don't, yeah, I don't know if you could do that as one ballot issue, it would probably,
I guess,
no, it'd be two, right?
I don't think.
yeah. I'm
and
a
so
bit.
then you run the risk of only
What?
one of them pass, not the
Yeah.
other, and then you're still at a deficit.
I feel like the balance that we have of around 20% income is a healthy one, right? And I'm not sure what exactly brings me to that conclusion. We kind of thought it was going to be between 15 and 20, and it's between 15 and 20. I think if you go much more than 20% with the income tax, I think we might need to reevaluate, right? And we can adjust that as a board by adjusting the rate if we need to, right? And I think if we go much less than that, we don't get the benefits of the income tax in terms of the benefits to seniors and commercial development and other things that the income tax is designed specifically to do. So I'm pretty comfortable with the ratio, and I think trying to tweak and change little things or change mechanisms and so forth is a little confusing, given the risk that we have in May, and it's a significant risk of not passing. So I think that needs to weigh on our decision. What can we make sure that the community supports?
So I think we have a resolution to, at the same rate,
Yeah.
all income for a term to be determined.
And I'm going to make the call out to all our community members and the request to all of our board members to reach out to your neighbors, right? Talk about this, find out about it, see if you can understand where they're coming from to ensure that we can get that kind of support. Again, I've had dozens of meetings already and things like that, and I'm looking forward to engaging anybody in the community that has questions. You know, I think the district is open to answer any kind of specific questions and so forth, and it's only by collaborating and talking and understanding where people's minds are that we can ensure that we can continue to have great schools in Granville. So, thanks for reaching out, anyone that has questions. Is there anything else on the discussion session, or is that?
I think that's it.
Well, so we've got a lot of other items on the agenda, but I understand if you're here for the discussion, we are excuse you now or any time. We appreciate your patience with us and your endurance. We'll talk to you all soon. Take care. Keep in touch.
Does that take us to the action agenda?
Thank you.
All right. 10.01 is approval of the agreement with Northridge School District related to services provided for students with special needs.
So moved.
Second. That's great that we can collaborate with another school district to meet the needs of our students.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. O'Day?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Thank you. 10.02, approval for marine biology course.
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
Thank you. So this is the course that we offer mostly outside of the school day. We partner with New Albany, and it results in a trip to Andros Island, and the cost of the teachers and the course and the trip are all borne by the parents in the course fee.
A fantastic experience. It really is. And it's really a teaching experience, learning experience. It's real scientific lab work and things like that. It's not just a vacation to the beach. It's not exactly the most luxurious accommodations when you get there. It's
Where
pretty
is
rough.
it?
A shack in
Andros Islands is a research base in the Bahamas. But if your kids have an opportunity to attend, I highly recommend it. A couple of our kids have gone and had a fantastic experience and really learned a lot through snorkeling and poking around with things in the water and seeing that scientific process in action outside the classroom.
Hands-on is
Yep.
a great way to learn.
Yep.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. O'Day?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Next is the consent agenda, 11.01 A through C9.
So moved.
Second.
As always, we appreciate the donations that we receive. Most of the supplemental contracts are for our winter sports. We have a couple of resignations of some coaches. We appreciate their service to our community. And then we also have another trip as we start to re-engage with our partnership with EF. We have 7 through 12 opportunity for a STEM trip to London and Paris during the spring break for 2024. And Mr. Eric Minton will be the advisor of that trip.
Can I be the school board representative?
That can be discussed at a later time.
Did we approve the American Legion addition to the flag and the bench last month?
Correct.
Okay. I heard that was moving forward, and I'm excited about that project. Yeah, I remember.
Do we vote on it?
Any questions on the consent agenda?
I see a typo in one of the names. Is that,
Might as well, let us know.
okay, in the donation of archery equipment, here it is BIRGIT.
I'm glad that he catches all those.
Say it, can you say it?
BIRGIT.
GIT. Got it. Thank you.
The roll call.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Ms. O'Day?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Item 12.01, approval of the October 2022 financial report.
So moved.
Second. Any additional questions or comments?
Nice job.
Ms. O'Day?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Item 12.02, approval of the resolution declaring bus transportation impractical.
So moved.
Second.
This is the first of a two-part approval process for students attending Marburn Academy and Liberty Christian Academy, where bus transportation is, as it's named, impractical to transport based on, you have to go through a whole test of distance, number of students, costs, other options, that kind of thing, and then this provides a stipend that then we'll approve as the actual payment in May to the parent for providing that transportation for their students.
Thank you.
Ms. O'Day?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Item 12.03, approval of the 5-year forecast.
So moved.
Second.
Anything else on the forecast?
And we had quite a bit of discussion.
Yeah.
It's a key thing, and it's out there and it's public, right?
I do
So
have
it's great.
a question. If we lowered the rate of the all-income tax, we can't do it just slightly, I forgot. It has to be 0.75 or the next level is 0.5.
Yeah.
My question was, if we lower it just slightly, will we still have sufficient funds over the next 5 years?
Lowered it to 0.5, you mean?
Well, I was thinking originally 0.6, but what about 0.5? What does that look like for the district? I mean, I assume with growth, that's not feasible at all.
Yeah, I mean, we're already projecting to deficit spend in the 5th year of the forecast, including the 0.75.
Okay.
So it would just chip away at that.
Okay, I just wanted to confirm that. I mean, that's what I thought, but I wanted to, thank you.
That was a good question.
More questions?
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Ms. O'Day?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Shaw? Aye. Ms. O'Day?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye. Meeting adjourned.